My name is Mehrdad Hadigi. I'm the head of the Department of Architecture, and I'm here to welcome you all, both here in person and also on the remote platform. We are here to engage one of our colleagues, Chris Bardt, who practices in Rhode Island and has been teaching at RISD for a very, very long time. I will pass the mic to my colleague, Marcus Schaefer, who will do the introduction. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's lecture. As Mehrdad said, our guest is Chris Bardt. Maybe one of the greatest things that I've been enjoying about COVID and the pandemic is this kind of time machine. We're actually back in 2019 now in this room when Chris was originally scheduled to lecture and when his book, Material in Mind, was published. So this weird thing of kind of postponed talks and postponed events is coming back to us, and Chris kind of comes out of the past, comes back to Stuckeman. I think Chris and his partner Kina, 360 Architecture, were here last maybe in 2009, 2010, it was a long time ago, and our lectures at that time were held over in the Palmer Auditorium as opposed to the jury space. So Chris is actually getting to know the building a little bit this second time. You can see from my copy of Material in Mind that it is a really compelling book, and I just want to say thanks to Lauren for setting it aside in the library, along with other articles and readings about 360 and things that Chris has written. So students, faculty, if you're interested, please go get those books and read about it. Chris will not be talking about the buildings he's designed tonight. He'll be talking about the book. The things that I most appreciate about Chris is, since I've known him, which has also been a very long time, more than 30 years, actually. He's always been someone who is extremely caring. Caring as a colleague, caring as a professor, a teacher, caring as an architect. Slow, patient, deliberate, and that's reflected in this writing. His argument is clear, the sources are varied and many, and he's done an amazing job of kind of piecing together our relationship with materials that really begins in a kind of primordial place without language, and is a parallel to language. If there are craftsmen in the audience, I think this is a book for you. Chris was educated at Carleton, RISD, and Harvard. He is a full professor at the Rhode Island School of Design. He is a founding principal of Studio 360 with Kina Lesky, and AIA awards like crazy. Let's give a round of applause to Christopher Bardt.
Hi, everyone. I'll probably be moving around a little bit. So in some ways, this talk is a little bit different than what you're used to. I'm not going to be showing you a list of buildings. I'm not going to be showing, lots of writing, from the book. So bear with me, okay? Then I'm going to go through something which is, in some ways, right in our faces every day. Our relationship with materials. And there's a lot of preconceptions that I'm going to sort of, in a way, try to unpack. And then hopefully by the end of the lecture, you'll go, oh my goodness, the way I'm going to handle things from now on is going to be different. Well, and of course, tomorrow you'll wake up and you'll say, what was that all about? So hopefully you'll go and get the book out of the library. So the book is called Material in Mind, and the subject matter is exactly that. And so what I want to talk about is our relationship with materials, and it's not so simple as we think. And in fact, that relationship carries with it a lot of preconceptions. And if you wish, you could look through the whole history of civilization as being carried by those preconceptions. So we talk about sustainability these days, for example. It's as if we woke up one day and realized that our directing ourselves to manipulate the world and the earth and the stuff in the world to our ends is unsustainable. And that is sort of one little glimmer of the realization that I would say that you are now going to watch snowball. The need to be vigilant and actually change the way in which we relate to the world. So I want to start with just this one image from Cavadas Manos in Argentina. You see these beautiful handprints from a pre-literate time as a way of understanding how to place ourselves in relationship to materials. And materials are not just things we direct, but materials are caught up in who we are. And that's the difficult thing that I want to show you. There's an essay that was written 25 years ago, 20 years ago, but it had an amazing resonance. It was a very short paper. You can read it yourself. It was written by a bunch of cognitive scientists. And cognitive science is a very new field that's kind of grown out of philosophy. So it's a form of kind of neuroscience meets philosophy. And these two writers, Andy Clark and David Chalmers, wrote a little essay, 5 pages, called The Extended Mind, where they proposed that, you know what, the mind is not inside the capsule of the brain. The mind is something else. And they made a very simple argument that said, look, if you're walking down the street and you need to refer to where you are, you'll pick up your phone, or in those days it was take out the notes that you had written to yourself in order to remind yourself where you're going. So where is your mind in this? Your mind has now extended itself to deal with those notes. It's, you know, we do it right now. We pick up our phone and we check a message. Where is our mind? It's not inside. Yet we still believe, I think, fundamentally, that we are still directing our volition out into the world. And I would say, no, it's the other way around. And this is what the talk is about tonight. There's another book that was very instrumental for me in a way, creating a kind of a background, a guidance, written by three scientists, Francesco Varela, Eleanor Roach, and Thomas Evans. Evan Thomas, sorry. I know a Thomas Evans, so I flipped the two. Evan Thomas. And it's an extraordinary book. It's called The Embodied Mind. It takes the extended mind argument further. And rather than say, well, we're constantly manipulating the world around us in order to make ourselves whole as a mind, as a sensitive creatures, they're saying, no. It goes beyond that. The inactive mind idea is to say that we are forming ourselves from our situation. And we know vaguely enough that's true. I mean, I would guess that most of you are studying architecture or landscape architecture or some design field. And that's one of the reasons why you're probably here, is that you have a vague idea that, you know, somehow what we do matters. It affects things, but do we know how? And so this talk maybe will unpack a little bit of that. So my argument here to start with is that the inactive mind idea that comes from the writing by those cognitive scientists is profoundly impactful on how we should be thinking about what design is, how we are in the world. And so the Cavadas de Manos, the handprints, is a reminder that as we, go through life, we are searching, for meaning, in some way. We're trying to find a way for life to matter to us. And so I want to make the argument that material is a key factor in making life meaningful. I mean, we talk about the distress people feel, that social media is causing anxiety, yada, 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 all that. I don't want to make a kind of case like that, but I want to make a case for meaning as being profoundly at the center of what we're doing. And by meaning, I mean something as simple as the feeling of relevance and connection to something bigger than yourself. I would say that's what we would call meaning. All right? The sense of connection and relevance to something that's bigger than yourself. That's meaningful. And so with those words hopefully echoing, I want to show you, and this is the only dry part, this is the only lecture stuff, but I want to show you something because it's hard to talk about materials directly because we have developed ways to work or interact our lives with materials because life is inactive. And so materials are guiding us even though we think we're guiding them. And so I want to show how you could say a kind of a triad forms itself. You could say there's 3 fundamental activities that we're always working on. We work through language, we work by making things, we manipulate things, and we work through images. These are the 3, I would say, a kind of a triad a classic triad of what most activity is. And that surrounds material. So we can't get at material directly, but we can get at how we think about things. And so if we just extend that a little bit further, we start to see that between making and language, the things I call mechanical tools, all the ways in which we assemble and put things together and think about tools and think about manipulating both objects and materials, they are always operating between making and language. And this brings up, the brain. So there's a little area in the brain called Broca's area, and it's very curious because Broca's area is the center of syntax. If you destroy Broca's area, you can't speak. You can say words, but you can't put them together in the right order. It's also the center, and this is being proven through brain scans of lots of students your age trying to make primitive flint axes. It's also been proven to be the center of making, fundamental making. So syntax then is a strange thing. Syntax is the rules of language, but it's also the procedures of making. So if you can't make procedurally, you're stuck. You can't manipulate material to become something. So the making of axes, the first tools of our species, and the development of language and the development of social relationships all go together. It's not like one happened, then the other, then the other. They're mixed together. So this starts us on our journey of realizing that materials have a way of affecting what we do. So imagine making, and this has been also something that's been discovered, when axes were made with one material, they were made in a certain way. When they were made with another material much later, they were made in another way. And when that first material was reintroduced to those who were making axes in the more advanced way, they went back to making the axes in the primary way. So in other words, the making was connected to the material. It wasn't something that was simply imposed on the material. And that's something that's interesting. So the other two, I say, of the two blendings between images and language, we have signs and symbols. And this is a part where I will show you how materials live through signs and symbols and form our, I would say, the medium of our culture. And on the last one is probably the most familiar for anyone working on design, which has to do with planning and the abstractions that come from planning, projection, technical drawing, and it becomes, let's say, a fundamental area, you could say, of digital thinking between images and making. So just to show you an example, okay, of how thinking and imagining comes through material. Right? It's very, very simple. Harley Earl, famous car designer, he was the first person, the first car person, to introduce clay into car design. So early on, this is his early work, and we look at it, we go, well, this looks like an old car. And in those days, there were two parts to it, really. There was the frame, and then there was the coach, the body that was put on the frame. And so Harley Earl became famous in California for customizing cars, and this is one of those customized cars. And he was starting to play with fluid lines, and he started working with clay. And he started fooling around with clay to find fluid lines. And so fast forward a couple of decades, and this is a Detroit, this is a GM studio, and there we see templates being used, clay being the material that is being carved, and the streamlining happening. So they're happening simultaneously. So which comes first? It's like a chicken and egg thing. So the clay is an indispensable material. You couldn't make a template and pull it on a material if it wasn't clay-like. So the fact that the clay allows that shape to be made and that the clay is conducive to making a template and then dragging it, right, is implicated also in the car design. So again, you have to say, what are we doing? Are we manipulating the clay for our let's say our goals of making streamlined cars, or does the idea of streamlining come up because this is what we can do with clay? And Harley Earl did something that eliminated the running board. There was somebody made a sketch, and the sketch was in soft media, like out of charcoal and pencil, and he put his thumb on it and wiped off the running board, and that was the end of the running board. If that sketch was done in ink, he couldn't have rubbed it out. He couldn't have done it. So the idea of rubbing something out had to live through the medium, the inactive mind. So a couple more decades, we have the whole idea of future-looking automobiles, the idea of the automobile moving through space and being shaped like an airplane. That has completely taken hold. But in the background, all these cars are being made by scraping clay. And so the irony of this is that even today, this is a contemporary sketch and model. It hasn't changed. So Detroit has arguably the most resources you can imagine for digitizing design. And so long before digital design came, let's say, into the world of architecture, it was actively pursued in Detroit. And so what happened is that they could make anything they wanted digitally. They could fabricate it overnight. They could make a foam model, and there it was. And it didn't work. And everyone said, how come these things that look so great on screen end up being so dead as things? So they went back to hand making cars, and most cars most car companies still have a studio where they're hand making with clay, because the sculptors are saying, somehow we understand, we feel that touch. It's quite remarkable that is still going on in this day and age. They still, of course, use digital means to help. They make the car to, let's say, the final eighth of an inch or an inch, and then they fill in the rest with clay. So the human touch, so your automobile is hand-carved, right? This is a very strange way of advertising a new car, right? Hand-carved Chevy. I don't know if that would go over well. So we go back to an archaic way of making. But it's so important to understand that the tools of making and the way we've engaged materials through time are exactly in the same, can be understood in exactly the same way, that those tools are inactive, that the marble chunk here, the frieze, is not being simply made because of volition. It's being made in a concert between what can be made and what then are the tools that can guide that making. So this is a template. This happens to be by Michelangelo, and so for the Laurentian Library and for the Laurentian Library project and for the San Lorenzo tombs, he developed these templates. That was his architectural instrument to think about architecture. So he didn't design something and then say, well, how are we going to make it? Not at all. He made a template, and then you can see the template's being modified a lot. So he would make a template, he would then flip it, make another template, he would trim it, he would cut it, he would add to it, and so he fooled around with the cardboard because he had both parts. And then he would give it to a craftsman, and probably they were all men at that time, those who sculpted marble. You say, here's the template, go ahead and make that piece. So the connection between making the material and the author and authorship has to be understood in that light. So the limits with which Michelangelo was working were highly important to the outcome of the project. The project was not a design that somehow got made. No, the design thinking came through the limits of the project. If you don't think that's true, you can look at his sculpture, and I don't know, most people don't realize this, but Michelangelo, everyone has this fantasy, the world's greatest sculptor of all time. He just went at the marble and took that chunk of marble from Carrara and sculpted David like in 3 days. It just appeared. What a miracle. The guy was a genius. No, he didn't work that way. He made small sculptures and out of clay, something soft. And then he had a tank of water in a studio, and he had a pedestal that was in the tank of water, and he was able to raise and lower that pedestal. He would put the body of the sculpture in, and he would lower the pedestal below the surface of the water, and then he would push the sculpture out just past the surface of the water, so he saw that first contour. And he said, okay, that's where I'm starting. And he would work from one direction. So Michelangelo was working very, very specifically in a very, very specific way, in a very limited way, from one direction. So the fantasy of the artist with the incredible eye able to work freely is not true. So he was working with what he could work with and with his instruments and developing this frontal approach to thinking. Now, was that connected to the Modernis, the templates, which he was thinking? I can't tell you that, and I can't tell you which one came first. But I can say there's a real consistency in basically sculpting from that surface. So the knee came out of the water first. That's the most forward part in the block. So he freed up the knee. Then he would raise this sculpture a little bit more, he'd get the next contour, and freed up the next part. So that's how he guided himself. And so, for me, the best evidence is when you see one of his sketches, and you start to realize the conceptual breakthrough that this indicates, which is that we look at a blank piece of paper, and we go, okay, it's a blank piece of paper, I'm going to put some stuff on it, right? That Michelangelo, because of his, say, obsessive consistency, could see the piece of paper as a solid. It's a solid. It was like a block. And that the drawing had to be excavated. So the part of the drawing that is first excavated is up here, the most frontal part. And so the drawing goes through a conceptual, say, rearrangement. So the drawing becomes, in a way, an excavation of a mass. It's a very, very different way of thinking, than adding things to it. So I just want to, in a way, not claim that much for it, but just to say, look, there's a consistency that came through the engagement with material. So the material had a lot to do with how thinking and the imagination happened. It's the same today. So we say, okay, material is one thing, language is another. They can't be connected. Of course, they're, the punchline I'll tell you right now is that they're deeply connected. Two little examples. You look at these little things, what's that? These were found in Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, not of course, no longer present, from about 8,000 years ago, before the development of writing. No one knew what these things were, and there's still a little bit of speculation about this, but it's on pretty solid ground, that these were thought to be game pieces, but now it's become clear that these are tokens. And tokens are a form of concrete counting. So this is all about an accounting system. So that a sphere might be a bushel of barley, a cone might be, 10 ears of corn. So it's the beginning of agricultural accounting. Because people were growing things, they had to harvest them and store them. So people had to keep a record. So there had to be an accounting system. So this is understood as perhaps the first time there was an organized accounting system to account for agricultural products. And these are pieces of clay. Again, clay, if you don't have clay, you can't do this. The clay is just formed from the hands. So you can you form a cone? Yes. Can you form a ball? Yes. Can you form a disc? Yes. So these are things you can do with your hands quickly. So you start to see the tokens, the hands, the accounting, the material are all bound to each other. You miss one, it won't happen. So this went on for a couple thousand years. The system was fine. But more and more stuff had to be accounted for. So here you see some more tokens, and here you see this big ball. That big ball was called an envelope. Yes, it's an envelope. It was where you put the tokens. So you went to drop off your stuff, and you needed to get the tokens, but the tokens they didn't go with you. They had to be put on a shelf somewhere, like in the bank. And tokens needed to be organized. So the tokens, there were so many of them, got put inside an envelope. Okay, so what does this have to do with anything? Well, the envelope kept the tokens because they've found quite a few of these, and you break them open or you x-ray them, they have tokens inside. And you can see these marks on the envelopes. So they think that what they did was they pushed the token and then put it inside. So on the outside, you could sort of do some kind of like, there was a record of the token. That push meant in there. But it wasn't much more than that. And so society got more complex, agriculture became more complex, so there's more stuff. And so what do? Right? You run out of simple blobby things you can make, so you start to say, well, can I make a mark on my blobby thing? And so you can see this very, very elaborate set of marks on some tokens, and the degree of complexity is now increasing. So what we're watching here is a story of how simple, you could say dumb, accounting, concrete counting, is starting to shift, and it's all happening in the medium of clay, which you can mark and you can bake it or dry it. And so clay has this marvelous property of being malleable, but then also freezing. And without the clay, none of this could have happened. So now we're shifting to like marks that are on the outside of the tokens in order to extend their range. And of course, we can start to see the flicker of recognition of like, this isn't yet writing, but it's like something's happening, where the concept of making a mark as standing for something has now arrived, as opposed to a form standing for something. Now just a mark stands for something. And then this is the final breakthrough. And you go, really? Yes, it is really the final breakthrough, because this envelope, they didn't bother putting stuff inside. It's a slab of clay, and they just marked the token marks on it, and they didn't need the tokens anymore. So from here to cuneiform writing is just a tiny step. So as you know, I don't think I have a cuneiform tablet in my images, but cuneiform writing was the first, the writing developed by the Mesopotamian culture about, 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. And so it just has these wedge shapes that get pushed into clay. So here we have the tokens getting pushed into the clay, but we're not using the tokens anymore. We're just using the token shapes to push into the clay to do the counting. And this tablet here is just a tablet. The counting is now getting arranged in a way that you can say there's 3 times 10, 30. So the counting is getting more elaborate. So it's starting to merge with exactly what writing does. So there's syntax, there's the mark, and there's nothing else. And it's on a tablet. So basically all the parts of writing arrived through concrete counting through this medium of clay. So this is a low res, obviously. This is I'm sure half of you have seen this, or if you haven't, then you can enjoy it for a second. So this is an experiment that's been done many, many times, and 98% of people will respond with one preference. And I ask you, which one of these is Booba? Which one of these is Kiki? And and you go, oh yeah, I think like, who thinks this is Booba? Who thinks it's Kiki? Okay, 1. That's about the right proportion. About 1 or 2% people think otherwise. 98+% everywhere, all over the world, every language. And so, and linguists and cognitive scientists have called this a phenomenon that has perhaps to do with the shape of the mouth, Booba, that it's like this, or Kiki is a more sharper mouth. And not one person has talked about a kind of material plausibility. And it struck me as so strange, because doesn't it go without saying that when you take a piece of glass and you break it, it goes k. Every hard material has to go k. There is no hard material, brittle material that doesn't go k. Even chocolate, k, right? Or pizza dough doesn't go like that. So it's almost inevitable that there's got to be a relationship between the material and the sound in that 98%. And it's oddly enough, it doesn't get discussed because because language and material have been held apart, that they don't go together, but they go together a lot more than people realize. Another way of talking about material language has to do with the codes, the symbols and signs of things. So I look at these 2 watches and ask you which one is the expensive one, which was the $24 watch, and which one is the $20,000 watch. And I'm not sure we're going to get 100% agreement. We might even get like 50-50. And it's a sophisticated problem, right? You're looking at it going, well, if it says Cartier, it's probably cheap, right? It's probably the New York sidewalk $24 knockoff. But then again, Cartier does make expensive watches, so it's very, very. There's a lot of complexity to the answer. So you're caught in the fact that in a way we are shaping things and they have become symbolic value. They're not. It doesn't matter that this is gold-like or silver-like or stainless steel-like. It doesn't matter anymore. So it's that materiality has crossed over into being a symbol that we're simply trading back and forth. Or these two chairs, right? This one's easier, right? They're both perfectly utilitarian. And I can ask you, which one costs $300 and which one costs $19.99? And why is the one on the left a bad chair? And so that's something that we would say, oh, okay, let's talk about it. It's like it's poorly made, or like it's because it's its own symbol already. It's the church basement chair. It's the surplus chair. So we know what it is. So we've already assigned it that. So we can't be any good, right? But of course, some incredible designer is going to turn this thing into the hottest chair on earth at one point, because they'll do something ironic with it, and then we'll say, oh, I got to have one, right? And so this chair is riding on its long modernist legacy, and we go, yes, it's finer, it's a plywood, we appreciate that, it's $300 a little expensive, but it's a little bit more sophisticated. So we say all these things without really realizing why. It's because it's all come over into language. Everything now is just a trade in sign and symbols. There's a lot of what I would say design constitutes. We have to be aware, though, that it is coming out of the relationship between material and language. So here's a twisted church steeple probably in Switzerland. And you go, well, why are we looking at twisted church steeples? Well, just as a kind of proof, evidence of how much material has symbolic value in a strange way. So these twisted cathedral or twisted steeples are not uncommon. There's quite a few in the world, and no one really knows exactly why. Some people have argued that it's the Coriolis effect, because the Earth moving in a certain way, this has a counter effect, and that therefore wooden steeples will twist in a certain way. That's been disproven. They twist in either direction. People say, oh, it's prevailing winds, or how about just wood drying and then twisting? It's probably the most plausible answer. But what happened in Belgium, a church burnt down with their beloved twisted steeple. So they spent a fortune hiring this fabrication company to make a brand new twisted steeple out of straight wood that they had to bend. They had to force into the configuration that they loved. So you can see here, this is a very strange way to understand material. So now material is at the service of let's say, a symbol language. So the untwisted steeple that was originally there, the fresh wood one, they don't want that. They want the twisted steeple because the material has become symbolic. So it's operating in a language-like way. So now I'm going to talk about philosophy and material. So we go, okay, philosophy is, it's not a subject that's perhaps central to everyone's life, but philosophy underpins most of the things we think about. We can't get away from that. We don't think about it every day. But I want to just show you a couple of philosophical ideas and how they're related to material. So there is this, say, ancient idea. These are from Plato and Aristotle, that Plato talked about eidos. Right? Eidos, the eidetic, the principle of the goal of insight was the idea. In other words, Plato said the veil of Maya, the stuff of the world, the physicality of the world is just uninteresting. It's a mess. It's in becoming. We need to see through that. We need to penetrate through the obscuring qualities of the physical world to get to the idea. That was eidos. And entelechy was Aristotle's argument that really everything is already present in the world and we need to simply sort of recognize it. And the drop of water was a kind of analogy that was used. So if you see a drop of water fall into a still pool, you'll see a ripple, and that ripple will be a perfect circle. So Aristotle would argue that that phenomenon is really actualizing the form giving first. So we discover the circle as a secondary outcome, but we first see the force of the drop of water creating a ripple. Now Plato might have said, no, there's only one circle. There's only one circle. It is the infinite number of points equidistant from a single point on a plane. That's the only circle, because everything else is an approximation. It's not really a circle. So you can see the two arguments they're still resonant. It's still what happens in life. And one of them is dematerialized, and the other one is coming through materiality. So you see these two things. These are two charts of the sky. So this is Galileo's famous first observational drawing through a telescope, and he is marking what he sees. You can say this is the entelechical side, like the phenomena of the world is being received and recorded and treated as the facts of the world. This is a contemporary of that time star chart, and you can see the stars are almost gone, but the idea is there, right? That these are constellations. That's the order of that's the celestial order, the constellations. So you see the constellations are rendered in 3 dimensions, more present because they're the idea than the stars. The stars are not important. It's the constellations that are important. Another examples of that, okay? This is a philosophical position that is guiding how we think about things in the world. So this is artifacts from a burial chamber in Egypt. These are vessels. So I'm just comparing 2 vessels. The Eidos vessel, there's no function. They don't, because in the afterlife, there's no need for function. You just need the form. So here the vessels have no interior. They're just barely shown to be vessels, and that's enough for the afterlife. It's really the idea that goes to the afterlife, and of course the New York City water tower, so iconic. And we see that's a perfect example of entelechy, the actualization of the form-giving forces, like the drop of water. We can see here the rings of the water tank getting tighter at the base because there's more water pressure. So that's the revelation of the world through, you could say, its material content. The same is true with inscription, right? The pleasure of watching a footprint on a snowy day and understanding that it's the material condition that is guiding what can be recorded, what can be inscribed, what cannot. So our inscription of our lives in the world is something that's an essential, fundamental thing we do. And everyone has a room. Everyone has transformed that room through their own inscription, and that room is your particular room. Right? I assume that each of you has a room. And so here you see, with the barest, the most fragile medium, a very transient moment, right? It's an hour that's recorded, and then it disappears. Here, we want to hold on. We want to make a deep record. And the material is exchanged, hard material. The inscription also changes. We're going to have to be really clear what we're putting in here. So all of a sudden, the letter with the serif. So these become, in a way, unconscious ways of interacting with material. Like you would never spend the time to try to do this in a material that can't support it. But you don't think that way. You simply don't. It doesn't come to mind. 2 lives. This one is also an Egyptian artifact. The skeleton's inside here. It's a little coffin for a snake. But there you see the eidetic, the form, the purified image of the snake on the outside. These hammers, which are actual hammers from craftsmen in Sheffield, England, these hammers were used their whole lives. So each craftsman worked a little bit differently with their hammer, and so the handles start to take on these fantastic, bizarre, twisted conditions, but that's a record of that life. It's the actualization of the form-giving force, the life of work. So the wood then becomes an essential agent for that life. Here's my only sort of architectural thing. This is quite, I don't even know if this stuff is even taught anymore. But anyway, Mies in the corner, was a big topic because he came to the United States from Europe, and the H-beam became the piece that he was going to solve and perfect. And so this was the first version, which was entelechy, in other words, the H-beam or I-beam at the corner was going to frankly express the situation of the construction, which was brick piers, the H-beam, but it can only point in one direction. It can't make a ideal corner. It's going to have to give up the ideal corner, meaning a corner that works in both ways. So this corner works in one direction very differently than in the other direction. So that's allowing, you could say, the form-giving forces, the H-beam, to just be what it's going to be and be very frank. And later on, now you go back to that Egyptian serpent coffin. There you see the H-beams being hidden. It's encased. And there you see these, you could say, the image of the I-beam now being used as an element in architecture. So architecture is completely involved in this. Architecture has always been part of that, you could say, the lie that tells the truth configuration of the creative arts. So architecture is always struggling with that because we're both trying to project or represent symbolically something and at the same time work with the materiality of the world and structure it in an authentic way. So those things are always colliding in architecture and design. So then we look at the digital conditions, and this is just the last piece about philosophy, because as we're entering, you could say, almost an exclusively digital environment, we know that we're going to do, and this is a project by a couple of MIT professors, and we know that we're entering into like a kind of period where we can do a lot of experimenting. So this is a volute structure. It's a particular structure that you can develop digitally. They did, and then they made it out of plywood, and it's held and corralled by a pretty strong steel frame, which is fine. They just wanted to demonstrate that they could execute this project. They could build it, and it's a very, very complex project. It could be done with like, it's an old stone masonry would say dream, and they built it out of plywood. And then what's so interesting about it is that this was also built without tolerance. In other words, the digital fabrication, the digital model was intolerant. In other words, it was what it was, as everything digital seems to want to be, right? So when it got built, there was slippages and expansions and contractions, and things didn't go together perfectly. There was something that was imperfect. Now, I would say that again puts us back into that philosophical debate that's been going on for thousands of years. So what are we trying to get to? Are we trying to get to a certain kind of actualization of form-giving forces through material, or are we trying to get through that to something that is the ideal, the immaterial perfection, the equivalent of what Plato would argue of the circle, which is the infinite number of points extended of specific distance from a single point on a plane. I'm going to skip this. It's a longer piece, and I don't want to take up, I don't know where we are with time, but okay, so I think there's 10 more minutes, okay? And then we'll have time for questions. So the bringing of measure and order to the world, to material, how did that interact? So we know very well that early Renaissance survey techniques and the development of perspective, I mean, I don't know if it's that common knowledge, but they kind of went together, okay? So Brunelleschi was a surveyor and brought those ideas to the development of perspective. That certainly was part of it. And Dürer also, was active in developing all sorts of machines. And this is, pre-digital, but it's already working on the disembodiment of measure and order and the world. So you can see the two operators here. The interesting thing is not one of them is making the drawing, right? So one is handling one side of the problem, the other one is handling the other side of the problem, but there is no one actually drawing. So it gets us closer to what it means to be, let's say, immersed in the digital way of engaging the world. So the Renaissance, people say, okay, the Renaissance, there was its ideals, that the idea of the human-centric world, and it was going to be guided by ideas that came through the development of perspective. That's kind of, let's say, a vague History 101 lesson. And my point here is to simply say that the means, the instruments, and the materials are not something that one can simply dismiss as simply tools that are the expression or the representation or the end product of ideas that are being formed inside that brain case. My argument would be to say that the ideas become active or inactive because of the interaction between construction, building, perspective, and the city. So when the Renaissance was in its peak, you'd say, oh, that's the ideal. That is it. But I would argue that the instruments of perspective are doing a lot of work here. The instruments of perspective are actually giving legitimacy and guiding what is an idea. Now I want to go back to, you can say the Inca, and I want to just make another connection to how the Incans worked with stone and social order. So we've all seen these incredible things that they've done, right? These stones that seem to be they're so skilled at carving these stones, they almost look like butter, being placed in here. But this is a great image because you can see that they could have controlled more. So there's a very bizarre aspect to Incan stonework, which is it's so controlled, it's so beyond what we can do by hand today. At the same time, it's deferential. It's not about mastery the way we think about it. There's a whole deferential aspect to it. It would take up to 5,000 men to drag these stones up from one place to another. And a couple of these stones were dragged almost to where they needed to go, and then they were dropped. And so some writing has been discovered, or some record which was passed. It's a complicated story because the oral records were passed forward, but came through the Spanish language. And so apparently stones were seen as living entities, or at least the formerly living entities. So stones all had a past life as people. And so sometimes, so it takes 30 days, 5,000 men to drag a stone up this valley, and the emperor king would say, nah, that stone's no good, leave it. And they would leave it and wouldn't touch it. So the point I'm making is that the way that society worked in those times had some connection to do with the enormous work it took to move stones around. In other words, you had to have a pretty authoritarian society. It wasn't just happy work. It was grueling. So huge numbers of people had to be organized. It was militaristic. Huge numbers of people had to be organized to do this. So what I'm saying is that the social order, the difficulty of the stones and the difficulty of the carving can't be separated. To give the opposite, there's that. To give an opposite condition, and again, I'm not a sociologist and I'm not making big claims, I'm just saying the material that people live in never gets talked about when we talk about social or society, social order. So this is Matera, a city of caves in southern Italy, arguably the oldest city in Europe. It's been continuously inhabited. And it has one remarkable feature, which is that the stone is so soft you can cut it with a knife. It's tufa. It's very, very soft, crumbly stone. A family can build their own shelter. A couple of people can get together and repair something. You don't need a lot of people. So this is a peasant culture. living through difficult times. They lived with their donkeys and animals because they weren't allowed to occupy land up top. That's where the landowners had. So they were forced into the caves. And so they brought their farm animals into the caves with them to keep warm. So it's quite an impoverished world. And they didn't even have the means to make their own food. They had communal kitchens. It became a very powerful culture. It's almost been lost, and there's not much of it left. The remnants of it are scattered and are more heritage things than living things. So I just wanted to show you the one little feature of this to show you how this, what I think is the softness of the material, in a way, is not disconnected. It's part of the enaction of a social order. Here, over 100 people lived in this little courtyard. It was hugely overpopulated, and people would have 20 kids, and maybe 2 would survive. It was kind of grim. It was tough. But in this brutal, grim time, there was a cohesion, and I would argue that the cohesion and the softness of the material were connected. So this is a little feature. So there's a step going up here into one, and these are going into caves. They're just going into, that's the only window there. It goes back quite deep. You can see this cave plan. So there might be the face of it, but there it goes all the way back. So, but just this little gesture here, where you see the wall is very low when they're all sharing their lives out in the courtyard, but then it starts to rise up and gives them like a touch, let's say the smallest amount of dignity to say, I'm here, you're there, that wall is coming up, and we're separate. So I would say the articulation of social relationships is extraordinary in that environment because that stone is malleable. So it can start to, like the snow you saw earlier, it can pick up small things. And there's an image of it just before. Now Matera has become a World Heritage Site, and these are now getting repopulated, if not wholly completely now. So authenticity. Material has such an important role. We say that's real, that's not. That's a fake, that's not. So authenticity is something that I want to talk about, again, as a way of understanding materiality. Because when you talk about the inactive mind and someone puts up vinyl siding, you could say that's an aesthetic choice, and that you live next door, and you could say, well, it's an aesthetic choice, but I don't feel so well. Well, finally, there's a reason why, because the inactive mind says you make yourself out of your situation, which includes the vinyl siding. So in other words, if we start to adopt this understanding of the mind as being inactive, we then have a much greater responsibility to our surroundings because they don't belong to us, they're not neutral. They actually are informing and forming each of us. So we have a certain kind of much higher responsibility than we perhaps realize. So we see the brick wall, and bricks have been talked about as kind of a source of authenticity. Richard Sennett wrote about this at great length in The Craftsman, because bricks, handmade, but they're hand-laid. So we look at this wall, and we know it's old. We don't even question it. We go, that wall is authentic. And we look at the way it's laid, and we go, someone had to be trained. Someone had to think about turning the courses. So we know all these things. It's good. It's good. It's real. Because of the work that went into it. And so we start to understand that it's not just the brickness of it, but it's how the brick was handled by who, when, that starts to create authenticity. It's not just stuff. So I don't know if State College has been blessed with stamp fault. Stamp fault, okay? Stampcrete, stamp fault. Stampcrete's the good stuff, right? So this is a picture. These are 2 scenes in Providence. So this is the stamp fault wearing out, and this is an old brick sidewalk, and I like this very much because of the handprints on it from the bricks when they were still handled. But that's something that has to also inform us. So the question of authenticity is not a visual one. It goes much deeper into material than perhaps we realize. So when we look around, we know that that's not We know that, for example, I don't know, this is a plaster ceiling, but it might be sheetrock. It's not real plaster. But we're okay with it because we understand the labor that went into it. We understand the process of it. We understand how to live with it. And there's certain things we don't understand how to live with that make us uncomfortable. So hopefully, this talk will give you a sense of, okay, maybe there's some tools you can use to understand when things are right and when things aren't quite right. And it has to do with the purpose, the labor, the materials. So is asphalt a bad material? I wouldn't start there. But I would say that what we're looking at is someone trying to do something in a way that's trying to achieve something that is, in a way, on the surface, a resemblance, but knowing very well that that is not what it is, and therefore trying to, say, monetize that illusion. And we feel that. We feel the monetization of the illusion. We don't feel the illusion, I would argue. So, very simple couple of things about material affordances. J.J. Gibson, a psychologist, wrote a very important book, several books, but the main idea has come through to us, which he talked about material affordances. He talked about affordances, and I'm going to talk about material affordances. So affordances is this idea that, for example, you see the stairs there? You're going to climb up those stairs. That's an affordance. And it's an environmental condition that is the allowance for things to happen. So that's what an affordance is. Material affordances are the same way. So materials afford certain things to be done. And so the more we can become conscious of that, the more empowered we are. So this is a student of mine years ago, came back from Japan, very excited about a certain technique of splitting wood, and made a piece out of, just by driving little dowels into a certain kind of wood. It had to be a certain kind of fir that would keep cracking, and so was able to expand the piece of wood, without breaking it. That was an affordance of the material. If he had used maple, it wouldn't have worked, would have just broken. So it's not that this is the outcome of an intent. It's the intent that is emerging in the affordance of the material. So if you say, I'm going to make a kite out of this chunk of clay, good luck. Good luck. And I think you're crazy, okay? Because it's not going to happen, right? I tried doing that, okay, and I'll show you in a second. It's not a good idea. So this is Leverance's famous flower shop. It's an extraordinary idea, right? That the lights that he's doing in the flower shop, which is in a cemetery, it's a solemn place, so the lights are looking for the lightless things. So he's making them flower-like, an abstraction. But that affordance comes from the bendability of the conduit and the fact that it goes together in a certain way. So it was like that brilliant idea of realizing you could bend the conduit. That's an affordance, a material affordance. So we get stuck with fixity. Someone gives you a straight piece of conduit, and you go, that's what it is. So immediately becomes fixed in our minds. So to break or bend the conduit requires a certain mental procedure. Or an electrician would say, oh, you mean one of these things that bends conduit. So we have to understand that sometimes we're given affordances in a prescribed way. And as designers and creatives, we have to find affordances that aren't prescribed, aren't necessarily visible or readily thought of, but they always have to work with the material. They always have to work with the material. So this was my bad idea. I said, you know what? I'm going to make a mobile. I was a grad student. I'll make a mobile out of lead and copper. So, well, it didn't work. Okay, I guarantee you cannot make a mobile out of lead and copper. You can have something that's hanging there, but it won't move. It's a dead thing. So anyway, I beat on lead and copper for a good month, and I gave up on it. And then someone said, hey, I saw you doing that. And why don't you go up to the Geo Lab? They have one of the most powerful presses in the world for doing geo crushing. And so I went up there and said, yeah, you can, we'll let you do it. And so that was, in a way, where this whole book idea started, even though I didn't have this idea for the book until much more recently. Because I saw this was the sort of aha moment where the crushing of the lead and the copper piece, revealed the material qualities of each of them. In other words, they each had their own affordance. They each had their own direction. The copper was stretched. It still maintained its integrity. It still had some kind of way of holding the lead together. The lead just wanted to flow. And so they were caught in each other. So to me, that was a kind of a breakthrough moment, realizing that applying the force on the material was awakening something. And I call this material resistance. That, like, you go through life, you want to do something, and you can't. Okay? Whether it's digitally, digital is hard because too often what happens is that you work digitally, it doesn't resist. It says, yeah, you want to do this? Go ahead. Do this? Go ahead. You get bored. You go, okay, well, it is what it is. So in a way, meaning requires us to encounter things, to encounter the resistance of materials, and to understand that the resistance of materials is the biggest gift that the world is giving us. It's not that we're going to smash through that resistance. It's the first moment that we can say, you know what, let me listen to that material. Right? So resistance isn't about a condition that you have to control. And I would say resistance is a condition that invites you to listen. And I would say that as a creative individual, it's such an essential thing. That would say that's the one lesson. If I had to say this is a lesson, I would say that's the one lesson that's critical, is that material resistance, the fact that it doesn't behave the way we want it to, is a gift. It's a gift that invites listening, and it invites a certain kind of, a different kind of attention, which we call the imagination. Right? So when this architect, when Leverance also, understood the limits. This is the famous clip-on church where he said, you know what, I'm going to work with the material resistance, the brick. I will not cut a single brick. Right? That was a monumental decision to not cut a brick. Because he was saying, I'm going to give up control. I'm going to listen to the brick and work with it. It didn't mean that I now have to make a church that's made out of bricks in a certain way. He used that to imagine all sorts of new things. This is not correct. This is a bad, this is the baptismal font. This is not correct. Right? It took a long time to get to that point. This is at the end of a life of work. But I think that the fact that he gave up on trying to control the brick made that an extraordinary project. Right? And so that's the dilemma we face, because digitally, the resistance is too often considered a problem to be technically overcome. Right? So you create something digitally. If something is not working with it, you kind of have to make it, you have to fix it. But that's a choice we have. That's a framework that we're operating in. So I would say, if we could, the next, I would say, breakthrough is going to come when we are able to work digitally, but to use the power that we're given through digital means to listen to material and its resistance. That is, I think, a very nascent project that has an enormous future. So this is the last pic, a digital brick wall, and you can see the blue foam trying to hold things together because it's not behaving the way it's supposed to. But I think this is an opportunity. So because this is ETH, I don't know where this was done, but this is a bricklaying setup, and there's a tool path, and the bricks are being stacked, and it's all dry brick, so it has to work with gravity, and things fall over, so you have to put blue foam there. And I would say there's an opportunity because already the limits of this wall are clear. It's not a digital limit, it's a gravitational limit. So the wall starts to become alive. Very, very slightly starts to become alive. Resistance and imagination, right? To realize that these deep cracks, these checks, which are never fatal, right? Checks in wood aren't fatal. In other words, the wood never comes apart. A check is a different kind of fissure. All right? And then to realize that can become something that, if you listen to it, can become something that is, instead of being a flaw to be fixed or covered up, that is something that can instigate a counter mark, right, which is the dovetail. And Pannone, the artist, has spent his whole life, in a way, on that project of listening. So if you don't know the Pannone's work, this is some of his early work. These are massive timbers, which he would get, and then he would excavate out the baby tree. So he would just choose a year. Say, okay, the 4-year-old tree. And he would go in and go to the 4th ring and just follow the 4th ring. So that is the baby tree. This is an older tree. He just went to the 15th ring. And you go, why is this thing skinnier and why is it wider at the top? Because it's upside down, right? It used to be the other way around. That doesn't matter because it's a timber. That's a form of listening. That's very, very different than manipulating things in order to control them completely, which is our legacy. That's why we're where we are. The same thing with the work of working even on a surface. Seurat was, of course, a great draftsman, famous painter, the developer of pointillism. How did he get to pointillism? He just had this idea and he started making little points. And, we can all say, wow, what a great idea. Well, it didn't come through thinking. It came through it's an active work with material. In this case, you can see his first works showed dazzling control, dazzling ability to draw. This is a drawing of a sculpture, and he is considered an extraordinary draftsman. He's in his 20s. Here we are, years later, very close to the end of his young life. He died in his 30s. And you can see he's working with completely different kind of medium. He's working with a very special, thick paper that has incredible texture on it. And he's turned from working with hard pencil, great control, to a soft conte, and is now using the conte as a kind of rubbing and working to make the drawing. This is an extraordinary drawing of his mother. And you can see in the drawing the necessity of the softness of the conte, the necessity of the roughness of the surface. So he's giving up his control in order to find a new way in. So that drawing is extraordinary because he's given up everything that he needed to make that kind of drawing. And now he's making, I would say, an even more extraordinary drawing. Mosaics and pixels, it's the same thing, right? One of the dilemmas we have. So when the Romans made mosaics, they really were, in a completely different universe than we can occupy now. We just can't go back there, but we can learn from them. So they understood they had a limited set of pieces. The pieces had shape and they had color. That's all they had. And so the extraordinary inventiveness that came out of that, in other words, the limits of the material, the resistance of the material, was necessary for inventiveness to happen. So, I'm sorry these are a little blurry, but there you see the fresh fish with a little glint in its eye, and you focus in on that, and there's like somebody understood how to make the glint, right? This is a blurry shot. And someone understood that the pattern of laying the little chips gave the eye a little bulge. So all the invention that happened with just these little chips is extraordinary. So there had to be at least 3 or 4 or 5 different ways of putting them together in order to achieve something. So constant invention. Now with pixels, which is extraordinary, right? I remember it wasn't so long ago that we got the first camera at our college, and you had to take it out. You had to go to the office and sign out the camera. 860 by 640. I was like, it looked like this, and awful, just awful. And so of course it got better and better and better. Now we've eliminated the pixel. The pixel isn't even, part of our consciousness anymore. We don't need to worry about it. So it's a very, very different path. So we've removed the resistance that the pixel offered quite quickly and quite effectively. That's where our technological, I would say, horsepower has gone. Remove the pixel as an obstacle, and it's being removed. So there's no more resistance in a pixel. So now we're in a kind of a strange dream world with images, because images are now so fluidly able to, in a way, do things that, now we have AI, now we have deep fakes, now we have a question of what's real, what's not. It's a very, very interesting time that we're moving into, because we've eliminated the resistance that allows us to in a way, gain meaning out of what we're working with. The inactive mind. In other words, it's very hard for the inactive mind to work with, you could say, an infinite pixel count because there's no resistance. We end up not, in a way, interacting with it because it ends up as a kind of a spectacle. Last image, and then I'm done. So this is the floor in our beloved industrial building where I've taught for many years. And these floors are, whatever, 150 years old. It was an old lead warehouse and then a baking soda factory, if anyone bakes. Rumford baking powder used to be stored here after the lead. Probably not a good combination. And so, but the floors they're probably, maple floors, rough, but, heavily used. Students would, that's a backstop for drilling, just abuse the floors, still do. Paint spilled on them, and no one ever said a word. It was just a working floor. It's a rough building. It's not a fancy building. And so one of the founders, this is recorded, so I can't give the name. So one of the founders of a very famous San Francisco-based company that deals with real estate all over the world. Okay, can you guess what that is? Was a RISD grad. Two of them were RISD grads, and one of them asked, in passing, asked the provost, I miss RISD. I love that RISD feeling. Those old floors. And they were a grad from ID, which had a similar mill building. And so the provost helpfully, at that time, provost is gone, the provost at that time said, I'm sure we can provide them. And, maybe if you want to, just replace them. I said, no problem, we'll replace the floors. Just give us the old floors. We'll put in the same floors, just new maple floors. And so the uproar was incredible. Everybody just said, absolutely not. And the students and the faculty just locked the whole thing down, and it never happened. But we never thought anything of the floors. We were abusers of the floors. And all of a sudden, these floors became the most important thing that we ever had to fight for. Now, why is that? Because they had seeped into our consciousness. They had become symbols and signs without us knowing. So, that's the end of that talk. Thank you. Questions, if there are any, or comments? Well, think about it for a second. Sure, thank you.
Can you talk, in the backdrop here, where we have a kind of material world, a kind of intelligence in the hand that connects to us, but may not need to be spoken or written. And on the other side, we have what seem to be references to data. And so phenomenology, sensing in one world, and then the other, a kind of shift in architecture to data having increasing relevance. Our buildings are made of data, our tools are sensing data. We're even writing data and giving them to manufacturing machines. Can you talk a little bit about maybe our need to be a little bit more attuned to sense and phenomena?
Yeah, thank you. That's a big question. I mean, it's not fair, Marcus, because I gave Marcus a paper that I guess just found out it's getting published, which is called Recapturing Meaning, and it makes the case for a material-based design process, not because of sentimentality or because we want to be more artistic, but because of my concern is that without meaning, without a meaningful engagement with things, we get lost. And so I would say that's probably the primary concern I have, is that how things become meaningful to us really matters. And what things are meaningful. People say, values. Yeah, that's all part of it. You could talk about values emerging out of meaning. So the way that we cohere I mean, the world, here's an example, right? Until, I would say, the 19th century, there was a completely different idea about the social body that we constituted. Our current idea of the individual is very new. It's very, very particular. So even in Victorian London, rich people and poor people, they were always, right next to each other. It was not you were all part of the same thing. Even if there was terrible class hierarchy, brutal differentiation in income, they were still proximate to each other. Very proximate to each other. It was always understood this is the social body that we live in. So I would say that my concern with the digital isn't that it's not an incredible new era that's opening. My concern is that it is about social coherence, and there are signs that that's becoming a problematic condition. I mean, we're living in it. We're living through it right now. There's something very strange that's happening, which I would call a sense of disconnect of the social body eroding or vanishing more quickly than we realized. So the importance of the meaning, you could say, for space to be recharged with meaning, to me is critical. We have to figure something out. The privatized city, the city which is a purely pursuing monetary interest, is in trouble. It's going to wreck us. So I think it's not quite answering your question exactly, but I'm giving you an elliptical answer, which is to say it all kind of goes together. So I would really argue against a kind of material engaged design process because it's artistic, or because it's sentimental, or that it makes us more creative, even though I think it does. I would argue for it as fundamental to what architecture is, what design is, which is a kind of attempt to hold highly contradictory conditions together in some kind of synthetic coherence. Poetry does the same thing. Strange words rub together that don't belong, and they spark something, and they actually hold together. That's what material-based design does. It pulls the attention of strange things together. And I would say that is also a kind of way in which I would call the model for society. Strange things that have to work together and spark something incredible. And if we stop doing that, we may be in serious trouble. And I would say already we're starting to watch the hyper-individuality of every opinion in a way simply become a kind of atomic collision rather than a kind of strange molecules being made. Like I would rather see a lot more strangeness in the world. And digital fabrication and digital means of design seem to be pulling strangeness out, even though the forms are incredible. The forms are, you could say, exotic, but not particularly strange. They're not, Zaha Hadid just did this, or Zaha Hadid's office with the Etihad just did this kind of incredible fabric, concrete formwork thing. You can say it's kind of amazing on so many levels. It's beautiful and it's fabric. What more is there to like? But instantly something about it. That it's a geometry that has been masterfully executed, but it's a geometry that you're looking at. So I didn't have the privilege of seeing it other than through photographs, and I've discussed it a little bit with some of the authors. But I would say that there's that is, I think, to me, a hopeful thing because it's working with the textiles and the concrete, and the imperfections are making it, you could say, the humanity of it is coming back in. But that's despite the data-driven genesis of it. I don't know if that answered it, but felt like half an answer anyway. Yeah, that would be good. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for your talk. I think now I'll have to get the book. I was thinking as you were talking about, you've probably read his book, Tim Ingold. He's an anthropologist who wrote about making, and the first chapter made me think of your idea of resistance, material resistance, because he speaks about basket weaving and how like he had his students do basket weaving, and how the grass that they was using was somehow resisting, or I don't know if he uses the word resisting, but somehow was talking back. And the whole idea that it's not either or, it's not me pushing the material, but the material speaks back. So it's on the material telling me to do something is basically a dialogue. And this is not really a question, but I was thinking in the notion of, if you can maybe expand on the idea of dialoguing with the material.
Yeah. So, thank you. So, yeah, the comment is about how to enrich this process. And first of all, you have to accept frustration. You have to accept a lot of what seems to be negative emotions. And we do a bad job with negative emotions if we don't embrace them. So I would say the first thing to say is that you're working in studio, you're working on something, and you get stuck. So what happens, right? Some of you get stubborn. Say, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it, right? And that's fantastic. And then you get exhausted. And the moment you get exhausted, things happen. It's amazing. When you give up on the thing that you're trying to do forcefully, things leak in because it doesn't matter. So once things don't matter, you say, well, maybe I'll try this. And you've seen it. You look at your friend's project, and this is why we teach, because we're not doing your work, you're doing your work. So we can look at it in a completely disinterested way, and that's very empowering. You can look at your friend's work and say, why, if you did this and this, it would work. So that's why the studio is so important, because if you don't work in studio, you miss all that out. So that's one of the things where it's literal. It's a social art. The other thing is Tim Ingold also wrote about architecture, and I disagree, because he said, the great architecture, the cathedral builders, they were designing and constructing went hand in hand, because they were laying the stones, they were cutting the stones, so the design of cathedrals was so authentic. I mean, I'm not dismissing what he's saying, because I think he's great, and he read my book. And so he then turns and says, well, modern architecture, contemporary architecture, they put these flat roofs. And I thought, oh, no, it's the same old thing from an outsider saying, those architects, that flat roof, it's a cliche. And I thought, I was a little surprised at that. And I would argue back and say, no, actually, there are just different ways in which that listing process happens. It happens through the means that you're working with. So that led me to think about, for example, if someone wants to do water shedding through manipulation of data, great. But my concern is that no one's going to do that, because it's not that interesting. But if someone says, I'm going to work on a roof by pouring water on some material, so I watch how the water runs, and that will guide me to making a roof, you get pulled in, because you have to pay attention to it. But if I say, let's optimize roof drainage through data, it's like, it becomes rather dry, right? It's hard to find the moment where you go, it doesn't work. Because you need to find the moment it doesn't work, or it doesn't work the way you thought it would. It's the surprise that keeps us going. It's realizing that creativity is defined as doing something or discovering something that hasn't been discovered before. So when you're working with data, you have to figure out a different way to be creative. I'm a big data fan, but not as a kind of purely an optimization strategy. I love the idea of data as revealing new relationships that we hadn't been able to see before. That data can give us so much, but you have to bring a kind of resistance back into play, because you can manipulate data and you'll never feel anything. And that, again, stops the listening.
Thank you for a great presentation, Chris. I'm actually asking this from one of the questions from our online audience. So this is a question from Dan.
Okay.
And Dan asks, it seems as though limited resources and conservation are also limits that we should respect. Does this then tie your ideas about materials to some approaches to protecting the environment?
Oh, the answer is absolutely. And I would say that even more so, I mean, this is where I started the talk, which was sustainability is our first attempt to listen to the world saying stop. It's our first attempt. And I would say it's become a vague term. It's lost its way in a manner. But I would say that the impetus is absolutely correct. So when there is no more this, all of a sudden we do get creative. It's exactly the same process. So when I remember I lived through so many stages of peak oil and, running out of this, running out of that. And there is something that is extraordinary, which is the creativity to find more oil has outstripped the creativity of imagining an oil-free world. So we're still in this real danger place. Now, the fact that we're not going to run out of oil, we're going to run out of life. In other words, we're going to globally warm ourselves to the point where agriculture is going to go in peril. There's going to be massive starvation. So the other kinds of resistance are coming due. And yes, we are going to have to we will become creative. So when there's not enough wheat next summer, and the price of wheat in countries that depend on it, we are going to have serious problems. So we have to become incredibly inventive at that moment. It's at our peril. If we don't, we will perish. So unfortunately, those are grim ways of the world resisting us, and our grim way of realizing that we are out of, let's say, willful manipulation of the totality of the world to our ends. We're out of that. We're done with that.
I think while I have the mic, I want to just also share one more comment from our colleague Felicia Davis, professor here, who says,
Hey, Felicia.
So yeah, she says, hello, Chris. Thank you for the great lecture. I agree with a lot of what you presented. However, we are part of a digital world. We are in as a sensing, being part of that stuff, in quotes, that is invisible. Why not embrace this stuff as something that is already part of you and your environment? Perhaps one can think of looping through many different potential ways of working, abstract, real, engaging in the process, the way Ingold writes about working with weaving, for example. So I think maybe she was also...
Yeah. I agree with that. My question is how? That's for me, the problem. We're too quick to abandon things. And this, I would say, this is purely an architectural problem, what I see, because I teach architecture. We're too quick to abandon, I would say, certain ways of making and thinking as we embrace the digital. Now, if you're in a field like glass, imagine if there was no more glass blowing, no more glass making, it was just digital, and you sent it to an output file. Would that change that field? Of course it would. So because glass sits as a fine art and craft, it resists going into the digital because its reason for being will go away if it goes to the digital. Certain kinds of glass have gone digital, which is making windows and all sorts of technical glass. But there's a lesson there. Architecture is a funny field. It wants to be cerebral. It is. We're always teaching architecture in higher education. We don't teach architecture that much in vocational education. In Switzerland, they do a little bit. But it's always like, okay, down there, vocational, up here, cerebral. So architecture has always had the conceit of seeing itself as a cerebral art. And so was very quick to embrace digital means and abandon the stuff that was slowing us down. Now we are in a very interesting place because we can see that it's not that simple and that we need resistances in order to make architecture. So my point is probably more to do with poetry. We need to find things to rub against each other in order to create sparks that allow contradictory aspects to hold together in marvelous new ways. And I don't think working purely digitally gets us there. So I do think we have to find hybrids. I don't think, I'm not a Luddite. We have to find hybridization. We have to find digital resistance. We have to mess around digitally, right? So if I crumple a piece of paper, right? One of your students, Marcus, crumpling a piece of paper, trying to find architecture in it. If I take a keyboard and put my elbows on it and go, okay, I'm going to close my eyes, and I'm not going to create an automatic drawing. In other words, I'm not going to create something that's going to spark further work, right? I'm going to create a disaster, and I just have to start over. So we need to find, in a way, that kind of way to engage the digital that is, in a way, responds to our own, I would say, immense scope of being, where rational thinking is only a small part of it. Reason is a fairly narrow part of the mental activity. So I'm calling this material and mind. So I am saying that the mind is greater than, say reason. It's greater than what can be held digitally. So I'm saying we can't forsake, let's say, the 90%, I'm just making it up, but we can't forsake the vast majority of how the mind is enacting itself from its situation. We can't forsake that. That's where we are. We haven't changed in whatever, 100,000 years. We're still biologically arcane things. We're still in that equipment. So we're not yet in the matrix, right, where we simply remove ourselves. But that's a conceit that we've had for hundreds of years. It's to say that the mind has the power over the body, right? The mind is greater than the body. That's the conceit. And now we're learning in many, many ways that the body of the earth is saying no. And that, I would say, is a profound lesson. Oh, Mehrdad.
So thank you, Chris. Wonderful talk. You trying to unpack all this stuff now, you're going to leave us with months of work trying to unpack what you tried to unpack. So complex. Thank you so much. I wanted to say two things. One, in relationship to the question that Felicia posed, both her work and also another group of faculty here who are working with robotic concrete printing. I would say, I don't know how long you're going to stay, but it would be interesting to connect with these faculty, because I think all of them are in fact using digital fabrication in the material context. So the two are not separate. So Felicia's been working on textiles and knits, utilizing data mining, and the power of computation in order to analyze and understand the resistances of materials and to be able to predict what can be predicted in materials. Another group of faculty I mentioned is doing similar work in 3D printing of concrete. So I think it may provide a slightly different angle than the ETH brick project, which was already a few years ago, and this stuff is moving so quickly. So I think it might be an interesting point of conversation there. So that was me as a department head, kind of trying to connect faculty work with your talk. Then I was thinking about the two models that you presented, the Platonic and the Aristotelian. And I was thinking if there's a different model. And this is a long conversation, maybe at some point you and I can have over a drink. So I was thinking that both of the models that you presented, the Platonic and the Aristotelian, rely on a break between idea and material. A different model might be that for architects, ideas are always already material, that they are not two separate things that we either bring together or that we keep separate. So, and we can talk more at some point. I can't say I have it all figured out, but just your talk really inspired thinking about the relationship between material and idea. Thank you.
Thank you. I have an answer. There's a third model, and you're right. And this is a very odd quirk that again is something that I've been working on, which is Cora. Many of you have heard of Cora. Is a strange term, and Plato wrote about it in Timaeus. And this is the third model. He said, well, life can't really work with either or. It can't work with the sensible or the ideal as separate things. It can't be an either or. So he's proposed this idea of Cora, which is very hard to explain in a few words, but call it more like a womb-like condition. In other words, a condition of being, which would be spatial, that is the preparation for things to happen. So he talks about Cora as being a crazy place where an idea could imprint itself, use gold. You'd only see the gold form, but it was imprinted by an idea. So this is way ahead of its time. This is exactly what you're talking about. So I call it liminal space. And this is the space of architecture, which I would champion, which is that they're not separate. They're always bound to each other. But the very key thing he talks about in Cora, to understand Cora requires what he calls bastard reasoning. You can't reason with it directly. It's not logical, nor is it sensible. It requires, I would say, poetic reasoning or sensuous thinking. And this is, I think, a very useful clue to continuing that conversation. Okay. Thank you. Okay.